How's everybody doing? Great to be with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house as we make our way through chapter 9 here in Tractate Nazir? Our daf is 62, Samech Beis. We're in chapter 9, continue our discussion of Mishnah number 1, and we'll get into Mishnah number 2. This is Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud, the laws of nazirus. Our Mishnah, which we opened yesterday, is that there is no nazirus. The laws of nazirus do not apply to non-Jews. Who's in the house? Yehuda in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Renee in Indiana, Lucy in Minnesota, Vanessa in Dallas, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Ryan in Jacksonville, Patrice in Utah, Norman in Dayton, Ohio. Over on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. Let's do this. We picked this up just a few lines down from the top of 62a. So the Gemara asks, we went through a pretty extensive derivation yesterday of why nazirus and none of the laws of nazirus apply to non-Jews. This is a voluntary vow, not an obligatory vow. In fact, one that is discouraged by the sages, but it is one that only Jews can take. And as we keep reviewing, only when the temple is standing, which hasn't in 2,000 years. Why? Because you have to bring the offerings that a Nazir brings, either because he became impure for the dead during his term of impurity or at the conclusion of his term of Nazirus. And we can't bring those offerings when the temple is not standing. Today, we'll continue that discussion, and something that we've alluded to will be mentioned specifically, that whereas a non-Jew cannot take an oath of nazirus and be obligated in it, it would be a meaningless vow. It's not because he can't bring offerings. A non-Jew can bring an offering in the temple. Not all of the offerings applied to non-Jews are possible for non-Jews, but some are, as we shall see. The reason, as we derived yesterday, that a non-Jew cannot take the oath of nazirus is because while one is a nazir, one of the obligations is not to become impure for the dead. A non-Jew does not become impure for the dead. In fact, a non-Jew cannot become impure at all. We're talking about ritual purity and ritual impurity. Ritual purity, tahara. Ritual impurity, tuma. Tuma only applies to Jews, especially in the context of bringing offerings to the temple. You cannot enter the temple if you are tameh, if you are ritually impure. Likewise, you can't partake of consecrated food. You can render others impure, etc. But this concept of becoming tameh, becoming ritually impure, does not apply to non-Jews. And if you don't have the possibility of becoming impure at all, it goes to show that nazirus does not apply to you, to the non-Jew. Okay, so let's pick this up near the top of 62a. So the Gemara asks, if so, when we derived yesterday that nazirus does not apply to non-Jews, if so, why do I need the verse, Leviticus 27:2, when a man shall clearly utter a vow of persons to the Lord according to your valuation? So as we saw yesterday with regard to valuations, erech vows, this idea that the Torah spells out that one way that you can obligate yourself, take a vow to make a donation for the upkeep of the Holy Temple when it's standing in Jerusalem. You could pick any number, the amount of shekels or dollars that, well, dollars didn't exist back then, but the amount of shekels that you are vowing to donate. But one possibility for that valuation is you could say, I hereby vow to give my erech value, or her erech value, my daughter's erech value, or my friend's erech value, right? And a valuation in that context is simply dependent on the person's age and gender, right? There are certain values given in the Torah just according to how old or what gender a person is. And then you could use that number. So non-Jews, have the same genders and ages that Jews do. And so while a non-Jew cannot obligate him or herself in an erech vow, cannot say, I vow to give such and such money to the temple according to such and such person's valuation, that vow would be meaningless. But a Jew can make a vow and say, I hereby obligate myself, or I take a vow to give the value corresponding to that person. And if that person is a non-Jew, the vow still holds. The vow will still apply. So a non-Jew can't make an erech vow, but he can be the subject, or she can be the subject of an erech vow, a valuation vow. And so we were looking at that body of law and how it would compare to the body of law of a Nazir, right? And since a non-Jew cannot make an erech vow but can be the subject of an erech vow, in the discussion of nazirus, we said, well, perhaps a non-Jew can't make a vow of nazirus, but perhaps some of the laws of nazirus might apply to him in the way that some of the laws of valuations apply to the non-Jew. And yesterday we derived that no. While some of the laws of valuation vows do apply to non-Jews, none of the laws of nazirus apply to non-Jews. So continuing that discussion, if so, why do I need the verse? When a man shall clearly utter a vow of persons to the Lord according to your valuation. This is stated with regard to valuations, from which it is derived that Gentiles are included in the laws of valuations. After all, aren't valuations juxtaposed to vows? Vows generally, which includes the vow of nazirus, juxtaposed to vows, as the verse states, this is Leviticus 22:18, when a man shall clearly utter a vow of persons to the Lord according to your valuation. And isn't it taught in a baraisa with regard to a verse dealing with vows generally? Any man, ish is the word, Hebrew word for man, any ish from the house of Israel or of the strangers in Israel, that would be non-Jews, who sacrifices his offering, whether it be any of their vows or any of their gift offerings, which are sacrificed to the Lord as a burnt offering. That's Leviticus 22:18. So what is the meaning when the verse states the extra emphasis, ish, right? So when a man will utter. Now that's normally translated as when any man, right? Now, what is any man? How is that different from a man, right? When a man shall utter or when any man shall utter. Now that's the way we translate into English, but the Hebrew doubles the word ish. When ish shall utter, right? When a man shall utter. That doubling, whenever a Hebrew word is doubled in the Torah, it's for emphasis. And often we add an English word like indeed or verily, right? But it's clearly unnecessary. It's emphasizing something. And whenever there are these doublings of words, the sages will, focus in and see if there's a law that needs to be derived from that. So, what is the meaning when the verse states, ish, any man? And the Baraisa explains, this serves to include the Gentiles, that they can take a vow for vow offerings and gift offerings like a Jew. It can be derived from this juxtaposition that Gentiles are included in the law of valuations. So the Gemara now restates its question. In that case, why do I need the phrase when a man shall clearly utter a vow stated with regard to valuations? Rather, this term man, ish, does not include Gentiles, but is necessary to include a minor who's 1 year before he or she reaches adulthood. So if a minor takes a vow 1 year before coming of age and shows a clear understanding of his statement, the vow takes effect, and this individual is included in the law of valuations as well. Let's just read what the law is about this subject before we continue, since this debate is a little complex. But the law with regard to Gentiles, even idolatrous Gentiles, right? Even Gentiles who are not monotheistic, who worship idols, can vow and bring burnt offerings to the temple when the temple is standing. However, they may not bring obligatory burnt offerings or any other obligatory offerings, for example, sin offerings or guilt offerings, And they also may not bring peace offerings, right? Because peace offerings are sometimes obligatory offerings, as we've seen in the case of a Nazir brings a peace offering. So now, but the burnt offering, right, the elevation offering, the olah, which is entirely consumed by on the altar as a pleasing aroma to the Lord, that is an offering that a Gentile can bring. Even an idolatrous Gentile can bring that offering and therefore can make a vow to bring such an offering, and that vow would be valid. Right? So Gentiles are included in the law of vows generally, just not in valuation vows. Not in the vows of nazirus, but there are vows that do apply under Torah law to Gentiles. So now, how do we know that? Where are we deriving that? This is what they're debating. Perhaps this extra word man, a man, is expanding that law not only to Jews, but also to include Gentiles. The counter argument would be, no, this doubling of the word ish is to include, near adults, youngsters who are not quite adults, but who are close enough to understand what it is that they're vowing to do, and so they are going to be obligated to fulfill that vow. Now, the Gemara comments, this works out well according to the one who says that a minor who's 1 year before he or she reaches adulthood must fulfill his or her vows by Torah law, as opposed to by rabbinic decree. Because the verse serves as the source for this law. However, according to the one who says that this law applies by rabbinic decree, why do I need the verse when a man shall clearly utter a vow? And the Gemara answers, the verse serves to include a minor 1 year before he or she reaches adulthood who is a Gentile, and that this law applies to Gentiles by Torah law. So the Gemara comments, okay, so this works out well according to the one who says that it is inferred from the phrase, the children of Israel, that Jews can be valuated, but Gentiles cannot be valuated, right? That law about the valuation vow starts with, speak to the children of Israel and say. So it's directed to the Jewish people, and that would exclude Gentiles. And one might have thought that Gentiles cannot take a valuation vow. Therefore, the verse states, man. According to this opinion, it is fine, as the phrase, when a man shall clearly utter a vow, can teach that if a Gentile close to adulthood grasps the meaning of vows, he can take a valuation vow. However, according to the one who says that the children of Israel can take a valuation vow, but Gentiles cannot take a valuation vow, which is the law, so then one might have thought that Gentiles cannot be valuated, and therefore the verse states the additional term man. This is what the sages did derive, that this additional use of the word man with respect to valuation vows shows that Gentiles cannot take a valuation vow, because this is a law directed to Jews, but that they can be the subject of a valuation vow, to teach that anyone, even a month-old baby, can be valuated according to the assigned value stated in the Torah. So according to this opinion, it is of no importance how old the subject of the vow is, and therefore the verse clearly cannot be including a Gentile on the verge of adulthood. Consequently, the question remains, why do I need the phrase, when a man shall clearly utter a vow? So Rav Ada bar Ahava said the verse is referring to all vows and serves to include, meaning to teach, the law of a type of adult Gentile who, although he is an adult, does not know how to clearly utter a vow. And the verse teaches that his vows are not valid, as derived from the phrase, when a man shall clearly vow. Vows of a Gentile are valid only if he can express them clearly, which is a result you would want, right? We don't want to be obligated in vows that were spoken ambiguously, and it's hard to understand what the person obligated him or herself to do. We would want that an obligation, which becomes a sacred obligation, only takes hold when the vow is expressed at least clearly enough to know what was vowed. Having clarified the verse concerning valuations, the Gemara asks, however, concerning the verse, when a man or woman shall clearly utter a vow, which the merciful one writes with regard to nazirus, why do I need it? After all, isn't the law of nazirus juxtaposed to vows generally? So why do I need the verse, when a man or woman shall clearly utter, with respect to nazirus specifically? And the Gemara answers, the verse serves to include the case of one who vowed by means of ambiguous intimations, i.e., he expressed only part of the formula of the vow so that his meaning is unclear. So let me just read what the law is, how the halacha came out of this discussion, so we understand it. With regard to the intimations of vows, meaning incomplete expressions whose meaning can be inferred from the context, if one's intention is somewhat evident from the statement itself, it is a valid vow. If the meaning of the words is ambiguous, meaning you can't be sure what the words said, even in the context, then the vow does not take effect. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rava. And the early commentaries dispute the precise meaning of the concept of ambiguous intimations. Generally speaking, if you're gonna utter a vow, which is discouraged, but if you're going to utter a vow, be clear what your vow means, lest you find yourself obligated to perform something you did not intend. So, as it is stated that Amoraim, rabbis of the Gemara, had a dispute with regard to this issue. With regard to ambiguous intimations, Abaye said that they are considered intimations to vows, and the vows take effect. And Rava said they are not considered intimations to vows, and the vows do not take effect. So according to the opinion of Abaye, this answer works out well, as the phrase, when a man shall clearly utter, serves to include all pronouncements indicative of vows, even ambiguous intimations. However, according to the opinion of Rava, what is there to say? Rather, the Gemara explains that the phrase, when a man or woman shall clearly utter, is necessary for that which was stated by Rabbi Tarfon, as it is taught in the Tosefta 319 that Rabbi Yehuda said, in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, if several people took a vow of nazirus as part of a wager with respect to an uncertain occurrence, not one of them is a nazir, as nazirus is imposed upon someone only if his vow is explicitly enunciated. That is, one is a nazir only if he vows in a definitive manner, not if there was an uncertainty involved, like I will be a nazir, blinator. I'm not vowing, I'm just speaking for educational purposes. If one said, I will be a Nazir if the Giants win the Super Bowl, right? I didn't say that, I didn't mean it. But if one said something like that, it seems like it was, there was a debate about this, a machlokas, a disagreement, right? Rabbi Tarfon would say, that's not a vow of Nazirus, whether the Giants win or not. And it sounds like Abaye would say, yeah, if the Giants win, you are then a Nazir. And then, of course, there would be other cases where at least you would know whether they won or did not win the Super Bowl. But if you made some kind of a condition where it was not going to be absolutely knowable what the outcome of your condition was, that would add a whole other set of problems to this. At any rate, so the Gemara asks, so this works out well according to the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon. However, according to the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with him, what is there to say? So rather, the phrase, when a man or woman shall clearly utter, is necessary for that which is taught in a baraisa, the halacha, the law of the dissolution of vows, namely that one may request from a halachic authority, right, a qualified rabbi, to dissolve his or her vow, fly in the air, and have nothing to lean upon. Right? The idea, and we've talked about this many times. So, for example, you take a vow of nazirus, and then you realize what it entails. You're like, I never would have made that vow if I realized what I was getting myself into. So you can go seek out a qualified rabbi, halakhic authority, and see if he can dissolve your vow for you. It's not always possible, but it often is. And we had that case of, had you known that the temple was going to be destroyed, right, in the years near the end of the Second Temple period, some people took a vow of Nazirus, and then when they went to bring their offerings, found that the temple had been destroyed, and they could never end their Nazirus. But a halakhic authority would have said to them, had you known when you took your vow that the temple might be destroyed, would you have taken that vow? And then they created an opening. There's a lot of nuance to that law, but that's a type of opening by which an authority can dissolve a vow. Now, this idea that a halakhic authority can dissolve a vow for you, that's nowhere spelled out in the Torah. And that's why they're saying that the law of dissolution by a halakhic authority flies in the air. Right? It's not grounded in written law. So how do we know that a halakhic authority can dissolve a vow? So how do we know that? So Rabbi Eliezer says the law, the halachas of dissolution of vows do have a basis upon which to lean. It's not made up by the rabbis, as it is stated, Leviticus 27:2, when a man shall clearly utter a vow, and when a woman shall clearly utter a vow at Numbers 6:2. So this is said twice. One explicit utterance is for prohibition, i.e., when one takes a vow, he is bound to keep it. And the second utterance found in the Torah is for the law of dissolution, i.e., in the event that this person provides a halakhic authority with a reason why the vow should no longer apply, the vow can be dissolved and he will no longer be bound by it. And this is an allusion in the Torah, not illusion, an allusion in the Torah for the dissolution of vows. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 9. Let's go to Mishnah number 2, and we're at the top of page 62b. Mishnah number 2. The previous Mishnah taught that the nazirus of women includes a stringency that does not apply to slaves. Right? We saw that nazirus does not apply to Gentiles, and nevertheless, nazirus does apply to women, and it does apply to slaves, even if they are Gentiles, right? A slave that was owned by a Jew in ancient times. Now, about the subject of comparing women and non-Jewish slaves owned by Jews in ancient times, generally speaking, they had the same obligations, right? Something that a woman was obligated to do, a Gentile slave of a Jew would be obligated in as well. And what was similar about them, we just started to mention, is that, for example, just as a woman who at that time was the primary caregiver for children, was understood not to have absolute control over her time, so she's not going to be obligated in daily prayer, which is a fixed positive, is a positive commandment at a fixed time. Likewise, slaves don't have control over themselves because they're owned by a master, and so they can't be obligated in the daily prayers, which are positive commandments with fixed times. Now, continuing that comparison. So there is a greater stringency in the case of slaves than in the case of women, as a man can nullify the vows of his wife, but he cannot nullify the vows of his slave. Now, we mentioned in the previous discussion that a husband or a father cannot nullify the nazirus of the wife or daughter. Now, that's after the nazirus is confirmed, as it were. A husband can, for his wife, this is a leniency for women, this is a benefit to women, that, because vows, often they're spoken during a time of emotion and then we regret it. So if you're a woman, you can have your vow dissolved by your husband or your father. If you're a man, you can't. The only way to get your vow dissolved is to go to the halakhic authority. But that is a narrow window. Right, so when a husband or father hears of the wife's or the daughter's vow that they undertook, whether it's nazirus or any other vow, he can nullify the vow on the day that he hears that she spoke it. But if he doesn't nullify it on that day, then the vow stands. And with regard to nazirus, he can no longer say to her, you know what, forget that vow, you should go and have a drink of wine. Too late. If he didn't nullify the vow immediately when he heard of it, he cannot nullify it at all. Whereas the master of a slave in ancient times, when slavery existed, could nullify a slave's vow of nazirus on any day. And we'll see why now. Right? So there's a greater stringency in the case of slaves and in the case of women. As a man can nullify the vows of his wife on the day he hears of it, but he cannot nullify the vows of his slave on any day, despite the fact that he can prevent him from fulfilling them in practice. Right? You can't nullify the slave's vow, but you can force him to drink wine. That's the difference. The vow will stand, but you can override the vow. You haven't nullified the vow. You haven't dissolved the vow. You could just override it with commands to the slave. Similarly, if he nullified the nazirus of his wife, it is permanently nullified, and it remains nullified even if she is later divorced or widowed from him. Conversely, if he nullified the nazirus of his slave by forcing him to violate the terms of his vow of nazirus, when the slave is emancipated, when he goes out to freedom, he is still bound by his vow of nazirus. That's what we mean that the master doesn't nullify the slave's vow of nazirus. He just overrides it by commanding him to, drink wine or become impure for the dead or get a haircut. He can override the vow, but the vow is still in place. And then if the master frees the slave, or the slave, achieves emancipation in some way, then the slave who uttered that vow is now held to it and has to complete his or her nazirus. That's Mishnah number 2. Here's the Gemara. The sages taught, with regard to what matter can his master force a slave? With regard to nazirus, right? A master can force a slave who is a nazir to drink wine. However, the master cannot force his slave in the case of other kinds of vows and valuations. And this Baraisa is apparently saying that a master cannot prevent his slave from fulfilling the terms of a vow. So the Gemara asks, what is different with regard to a nazir that a master can force his slave to transgress his nazirus, as the merciful one states, to bind his soul with a bond? Numbers 33. That's in the general law of vows, that if you take a vow, you have made an obligation on yourself that if you don't fulfill it, it's a sin. It's a transgression, as if you transgressed one of the commandments in the Torah. Right? And the wording of that is to bind your soul with a bond when you take a vow. But a slave does not have possession of his own soul, as it were, because he's enslaved, and that's why he can't take a vow of nazirus, right? From which it is inferred that he cannot take vows. Wait a minute. What is different with regard to nazirus that a master can force his slave to transgress his nazirus? As the merciful one states, to bind his soul with a bond, from which it is inferred that the Torah is referring only to one whose soul is in his possession, i.e. who is not owned by another. And this excludes a slave whose soul is not in his possession because he is under his master's control. Well, if so, then even with regard to vows, other vows, the same law should apply as well, as that verse is written in the context of vows in general, not specifically vows of nazirus. So why is a master unable to compel his slave to break other kinds of vows, right? So if a slave said, I vow, not to eat that peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the master can't come in and say, eat that peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Whereas if the slave said, I'm hereby a nazir, the master can come in and say, drink that wine, and the slave will be obligated to do so. Why do we have this discrepancy? So Rav Sheshes said, with what are we dealing here? With a case where a cluster of grapes was placed before the slave, and he vowed not to derive benefit from it. Now, with regard to vows, when he is prohibited from eating this cluster, he is not rendered prohibited from eating other clusters of grapes. Therefore, the master cannot force him to eat it, as he has no reason to insist that the slave consume this particular cluster of grapes. By contrast, with regard to nazirus, when he is prohibited from eating this cluster, he is rendered prohibited from consuming all clusters of grapes. Right? A nazir cannot consume any product of the grapevine. Therefore, the master can force him to eat. And this is because the lack of food weakens the slave, who is the property of his master. So the Gemara asks, and with regard to vows, are we not dealing even with a situation where he has only this cluster of grapes before him, and he vows not to eat it, in which case, if he does not eat, he is weakened. So why can't the master say, yes, no, eat that cluster of grapes? And rather, Rava said, no, that's not the right example to understand this difference. Rather, the difference between vows of nazirus and other vows in the context of slaves concerns a case where there was a grape seed, which provides only negligible nourishment, that was placed before the slave, and he vowed not to eat it. And with regard to vows concerning which he is prohibited to eat only this one seed, the master cannot force him to eat it, as refraining from eating a grape seed would not weaken him. With regard to a nazir who's prohibited from consuming other grape products as well, the master can force him. So the Gemara again asks, and with regard to vows, are we not dealing even with a situation where he has only this grape seed in front of him, in which case if he does not eat it, he would be weakened? Why then can the master compel him to violate only his nazirus vow, but not a regular vow? And rather, and I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. Rather, Abaye said that the Baraisa does not, in fact, list cases in which a master can compel his slave to violate his vow, but rather means the following. With regard to what situation is a master who wants to negate his slave's vow required to force his slave to violate his vow by stating explicitly that he does not want him to fulfill it? It is the case of a vow of nazirus. But he is not required to force him in the case of other vows, and he is not required to force him in the case of an oath, as these do not take effect at all. And what is the reason for this? It is as the verse states with regard to oaths, or if anyone swear clearly with his lips to do evil or to do good. And just as the good mentioned in this verse is referring to a voluntary action, so too evil is voluntary. For example, if he takes an oath not to derive benefit from an item. And this excludes a slave whose oath or vow would cause evil to others, as it is not in his power to affect his master adversely. Right? The simple case, the slave could take a vow and say, I hereby vow I will not do any work for the next month. Okay, he does not have the power to make that vow. So that is a vow that the master can override. However, if the slave takes a vow that is not going to adversely affect the master, then the master cannot step in and tell him, no, you will not fulfill that vow. He has to let the slave fulfill his vow. So here too, as the owner will suffer if his slave's diet is restricted, a slave may not accept a vow or an oath upon himself. But in the converse case, it would be a different outcome. And that concludes our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 9, and that's where we're going to leave off for today. Let's see if we have questions or comments on Nazir 62. Sharon, doesn't the prayer of Kol Nidre follow the prescribed formula for the dissolution of vows? Great question, right? So Sharon is referring to the fact that on the eve of Yom Kippur, we recite the Kol Nidre, where we basically say, all of our vows that we will vow in the year to come, I think also in the year that passed, are not vows, right? And we're making a stipulation about ourselves that we can't be trusted, that the words of our mouths, especially when we get emotional, can come out like an oath. And so proactively, we're saying, well, if we should utter words that would bind us in a vow, we want to be excused from that immediately. Now, as far as I know, that stipulation, it's post-biblical, right? The idea of Kol Nidre is actually somewhat recent. I mean, maybe 1,000 years. I can't remember exactly when it was developed, but I mean, I think that text, is it even in the Gemara? It's definitely not in the Mishnah. Somebody maybe could look that up quickly. But it's the same idea, right? Oaths and vows are a real problem. And, we'll get more into oaths and vows. Or did we already do Nadarim? I'm just so verklempt. No, right? Yeah, it's next. Right? 18. No. I'm an idiot. Okay, Nadarim was the last one we did because of that break we had in the fall. I was confused. Okay, but anyway, the laws of vows and oaths, complicated and nuanced. I think the important theme that we want to always remember is that when you make a neder, right, when you take an oath, it's a serious matter. Right, and whether we're specifically going to be obligated, according to Torah law, in a vow and to fulfill it, words have power. Right, words have power. If you make a promise to someone, if you make an oral agreement, a contract, offer acceptance, etc., that's real. Right, your word is your bond. Your word is your bond. You're bound by your words. Your word is your bond. Right. That's not just an old-fashioned way of speaking, from the days when honor meant something and now we're much more loosey-goosey. No, your words matter, right? And if you bind yourself with an obligation to do something, and then you don't do it, you have to realize that that is a serious transgression. So don't utter words that create a bond, and don't get yourself into that kind of situation or that kind of trouble. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night. We'll pick it up tomorrow with page 63. Actually, at the end of 62, be with Mishna number 3. Have a great night.